Welcome back, Sebastian here. It's time for my power rankings for the 2025 Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. So pretty controversial Grand Prix to say the least. Not the most exciting in terms of action on track, but I would say, for example, better than Japan, for example. Although, to be fair, that's setting the bar quite low. So let's get started right away with our power rankings. So starting off with number 20, a driver who I think has been on the hot seat for the first part of the season, and another Grand Prix that was not particularly strong, I would say, and that is Jack Doohan. So for Doohan, qualified 17th, out-qualified by his teammate Pierre Gasly by about 0.3 of a second. That gap, in itself is a bit of an improvement on some of the recent races where it's been 6/10, 7/10, but still not a great qualifying session for Doohan. Now, for better or worse, Doohan's teammate Gasly was out opening lap of the race, contact with Tsunoda, and that meant that a direct comparison with his teammate, in terms of lap time, race pace, not really possible. But, I think most people would say the Alpine was probably about similar pace to the Williams, similar pace to the Racing Bulls. The fact that Doohan finished so far off both of those cars, I think, was quite troubling. He finished basically second last on the road as well. So again, not a great start for Doohan, not a great race. Tire management, just race pace in general, has not been a strong suit, and that was something that I was definitely worried about going into the season. And I think it's something that's kind of rearing its head, and it's something that was a bit of an issue this time out in Jeddah. So that's why I've decided to rank Doohan in 20th. Now, number 19 is Gabriel Bortoleto. Now, for Bortoleto, qualified 20th, out-qualified by his teammate Hulkenberg by 6.8 of a second. Now, missed all of FP2, the only representative session in terms of, track temperatures and all that. So again, not really his fault because that he missed FP2. So again, it was always going to be a bit of a challenge going into qualifying, but still 6 and 8/10 is quite a bit, and qualifying dead last. I know it's a Sauber, but still not a great qualifying session for Bortoleto. In the race, finished 18, so moved up 2 positions, but still last driver on track. Pitted opening lap, went on the hard tires to basically see if they could eke out a full race distance on the one set of tires. Didn't really work out, ends up finishing last. Again, had a bit of a moment with Lawson and Alonso. I'm not holding that against him, but again, not a particularly spectacular weekend, and unfortunately, when you're driving the slowest car on track and you're not having a particularly good weekend, you're often going to end up more often than not, towards the bottom of my power rankings. And that's exactly where Bortoleto finds himself this week. Now, number 18 is Lance Stroll. So for Stroll, qualified 16th, out-qualified by his teammate Alonso by about 1/10 of a second. Now, again, Alonso didn't finish his final lap in Q1, already into Q2. So the gap's probably a little bit bigger than that if, Alonso actually finishes his lap. In terms of the race itself, pretty anonymous. Went for the alternative strategy, starting on the hard tires, pitting for mediums after the halfway point of the race. Similar strategy to Hadjar, worked out pretty well for him, not so much for Stroll. I know for the Aston, race pace not particularly strong, but again, this was another race where it felt like Stroll was kind of stuck fighting cars that were quite a bit slower than his. So again, not a strong weekend for Stroll. Number 17 is Yuki Tsunoda. Now for Tsunoda, qualified 8th, but in that Q3 session, all important final part of qualifying, out-qualified by his teammate Verstappen by 9.1 of a second. Qualifying gap that's really, a bit too much. A bit like what I said about with Alonso and Stroll, where, Alonso was already through into Q2 because he had set a time that was good enough. For Tsunoda, even if his qualifying gaps to Verstappen in Q1 and Q2 are, 2/10s, 3/10s, and, those are perfectly reasonable gaps. The problem is that, obviously for Verstappen, just like with many of the other front-running drivers, as they progress through the stages of qualifying, they will start to take more risks. They will start to, go at, 100%. Whereas it feels like for Tsunoda, as qualifying ramps up, as we get to Q3, he's just not able to, get all the way to that 100% level, or he's unfortunately making mistakes when he's at that level, which again would be costing him lap time. So again, qualifying time is a little bit of a concern. Out of the 3 sessions he's done at Red Bull, the first session at Suzuka, Gap was about half a tenth in the end, or I should say half a second in the end. That, through 3 sessions is the closest that Tsunoda's come to Verstappen in qualifying. And again, I do think in Red Bull it will start to be a little bit of a concern. Obviously, I still think he's doing better than Lawson did over those first two races, but still, unfortunately, when the bar is on the floor, it's pretty easy to clear that bar. And for Tsunoda, race pretty short. Contact on the opening lap, made contact with Gasly out at turn 3. Basically, I believe it's actually turn 4 is the corner, but the third proper corner of the track. Unfortunately, that was it for Tsunoda's race. I do think it was, I think the stewards calling it a racing incident, I do think that was fair. I don't think you could really attribute blame 100% to either driver, which is, that's, the situation where you would give a penalty. But, I think if I was in Tsunoda's shoes, of course, with hindsight, I think Tsunoda probably should have backed out of the corner, not tried to go alongside Tsunoda, or not alongside Gasly into a corner where, again, it's very, very narrow. You can't really go 2 cars wide there. So I think for Tsunoda, a little bit of an unfortunate race, but again, he's already very, very far behind his teammate Verstappen in points. Again, I know that's not the goal, but for Red Bull as a constructor, they're already about 100 points behind McLaren in the Constructors' Championship, and at this point, unless those flexi wing rule change, the rule change in Spain changes things drastically, I think Red Bull probably already have lost the Constructors' Championship, and that is what Tsunoda is there to help with. Now, number 16 is Esteban Ocon. Pretty anonymous weekend. Qualifying, a bit of a struggle, I must say. Qualified 19th, out-qualified by his rookie teammate Oliver Behrman by 5.5 tenths. Ocon's been, I think, quite underwhelming. I think in one lap pace, 2 qualifying sessions where he's had massive gaps to Behrman, another one where he's bent it in the wall, and that's 3 out of 5 qualifying sessions so far this year. So I think for Ocon, at Alpine he was, I would say pretty decent over one lap, and again, it's a bit of a surprise that he struggled as much as he had to start this season in qualifying. So again, qualifying not great. Race pace for the Haas not as good as it's been at some other tracks like China, Bahrain, and that unfortunately held Ocon back quite a bit. But again, qualifying was very, very poor, so that was ultimately always going to hold him back on these power rankings. Number 15 is Pierre Gasly. Good qualifying session, qualified 9th in the Q3, out-qualified doing by about 3 tenths, like I said before. But unfortunately, for opening lap collision with Tsunoda, and that's always going to limit how high I can rank him on my power ranking. So I think 15th, again, it's not, the bottom 5 drivers, but again, can't really rank him any higher than that. Number 14 is Lewis Hamilton. This is, for whatever reason, one of Hamilton's worst circuits in the ground effect era. He's been out-qualified every single year in the ground effect era. I know he out-qualified Bottas in 21, but 2022, 2023, 2024, and now 2025, he's been out-qualified by his teammate all 4 years. Out-qualified by Charles Leclerc by half a second, qualified 7th, and then in the race, again, not particularly strong pace, ends up 7th behind both Mercedes, even though I think the Ferraris were definitely the better car on track, at least in the race in terms of tire wear, just race pace. So again, not particularly promising for Hamilton, I would say. Comprehensively, I think all around probably his worst weekend at Ferrari so far. Although I think you can make some arguments for example, getting disqualified from China, the pretty missile, strategy calls from Australia. Those were obviously pretty bad weekends as well. But again, for this one, it just felt like the pace was not there, and I do think that there are going to be some pretty big question marks in Maranello. Why is Hamilton struggling so much? Do we really, replace Sainz with a driver who's, I think, objectively speaking, it has been performing worse than Sainz did, on average over his 4 years at Ferrari. Now, number 13 is Liam Lawson. Again, a little bit of a better weekend, especially compared to the first 4. Out-qualified his teammate Hadjar by about 2.2 tenths of a second, qualified 12th. Unfortunately, not a great start. Let his teammate pass at the start, and even, with, 2 cars that started ahead of him, Tsunoda and Gasly, both retiring from the race, still ends up P12, which again, I think a little bit unfortunate for him. Picked up that 10-second penalty. I honestly think that penalty was pretty bogus, so should have finished 11th on the road. But nonetheless, I think, a bit more positive weekend for Lawson from what's been, a pretty tough start to his first full campaign in F1. So he's going to want to take this momentum, out qualifying Hajar for the first time, out of 3 attempts, and he's going to want to take that, build that forward, and try to build towards, scoring points on, a semi-regular basis, because I do think that's the pace that the Racing Bulls has. I do think that this is a car that should be scoring points more often than not. Number 12, I'm going to go with Nico Hülkenberg. So for Hülkenberg, qualified 18th, but out-qualified his teammate Bortoleto by 6.8 tenths. We know the Sauber is pretty bad, particularly over one lap. I do think, maybe there was a little bit more in the car, but nonetheless, for Hülkenberg, a bit of a quiet weekend, progressed up to 15th. Didn't really see a whole lot of him in the race, but I think, again, doing a solid job in the Sauber. Number 11, Oliver Behrman, a bit of a similar situation. Hülkenberg, the better of his, between himself and his teammate in a car that was not particularly strong this past weekend. For Behrman, qualified 15th, qualified Ocon by 5.5 tenths. And then in the race, again, similar to Hülkenberg, pretty quiet weekend, but, again, progressed up to 13th on the road, again, benefiting from those 2 retirements of Tsunoda and Gasly. Number 10 is Kimi Antonelli. Antonelli, to be honest, in my power rankings, has been very, very consistent. He's always kind of been about the middle, hasn't had really any completely awful weekends, although I think last time out in Bahrain, I did rank him a bit lower. He's always kind of been about the middle, hasn't had, any weekends where I think he's been absolutely spectacular. He's been better than George Russell on pace, for example. But again, I think he's just been, very, very solid. And again, at 18 years of age, and the fact that he's basically been speed tracked to the lower formula, I honestly think he's doing, very, very well. So for Antonelli, qualified 5th, out-qualified by his teammate Russell by 4.5 tenths. And then in the Grand Prix, finished 6th, lost position to a recovering Lando Norris. But still, I think, overall a pretty solid weekend by the rookie. Number 9 is Lando Norris. Now, of course, for Norris, again, I said this before, if I was doing this just for qualifying, Norris would easily end up in the bottom 5. If I was doing this just for the race, Norris would probably end up, 5th, 6th, about that range. And again, because I'm doing this for the whole weekend, Norris ends up somewhere in the middle. So qualifying, of course, big crash in Q3, starts P10, and that, of course, immediately puts him on the back foot, basically takes him out of contention for the win without some crazy safety car or red flag luck. Realistically, it was always going to be Piastri or Verstappen for the win. And, I think for Norris, the most he could have really achieved on Sunday was 3rd. Again, did come somewhat close, but again, not really, close enough. Ends up coming 4th in the Grand Prix. I think, a decent recovery drive. Some of those overtakes, I think he made a little bit more difficult than they needed to be. For example, it took him 3 attempts to overtake Hamilton, for example, if he was able to do that on the first attempt, maybe he's able to put a bit of pressure on Leclerc at the end of the Grand Prix. But again, for Norris, loses the championship lead, and just for whatever reason, I think the pressure's definitely gotten to him being in the fastest car, as much as he doesn't want to admit it, and the fact that he's made so many mistakes over the course of the not necessarily the first race, although there was that mistake there, but just the fact that he's made so many mistakes in the first 5 races of the season. I think, unfortunately for both Piastri, not necessarily unfortunately for Piastri, but I think, of course, for Piastri, made that mistake in the opening race of the season, but, since then it's been almost bulletproof. And I think at this point, I think if I was a betting man, I'm not, but if I were, I think, at this point, Piastri would be the favorite for the Drivers' Championship, just because he's been on such much better form than Norris has. I think that's unfortunate for Norris, given that, the last 2 seasons as teammates together with Piastri, he's had a, very decisive advantage. So the fact that, McLaren has fastest car from the start of the season, and, the switch is kind of flipped. Piastri is the one who's, had the stronger performance. I think, it does kind of show that, Norris, just for whatever reason, either it's psychological, mental, or perhaps he's just not able to adapt to this year's car for whatever reason. It's definitely been a bit of a slog. And if he wants to, mount a successful World Drivers' Championship challenge, he's going to have to turn this around, relatively quickly, I would say, in the next, 3 to 4 races, I would say. Now, moving up to number 8, I'm going to go with Fernando Alonso. Now, for Alonso driving the Aston Martin, definitely not the particularly quick car, but it always feels like Alonso gets the most out of the car. He's been extremely consistent qualifying this year. He's qualified 12th or 13th every Grand Prix this year, despite the fact that again, car is not particularly strong, and the fact that he's 43 years of age. Out-qualified Stroll by about 9/10 or 900ths, I should say. And then the Grand Prix moves up a couple of positions, benefited from Lawson getting the penalty and, the other drivers getting, retiring. But still, in a race where I think many thought that, the Astons were competing with Sauber for slowest car on the grid, I think Alonso did a pretty good job. And so for that reason, I put him 8th on my power rankings. Number 7, I'm going to go with the first of the two Williams, and that is Alex Albon. So for Albon, qualified 11th, out-qualified by his teammate Sainz by 800ths of a second. And again, you're kind of getting the sense that Sainz is starting to get on top of the car. He's won the last 2 qualifying battles. So this is something where Albon's going to have to, be a little bit concerned and trying to make sure that he's not, slipping away too far in one lap pace. He's had a very, very good start to the year. And again, I think this was a decent race, finished 9th on the road from an 11th place start. And again, good teamwork between the two of them to make sure that Hadjar didn't get ahead of either of them. But nonetheless, I think, a decent weekend for Albon. Number 6 is the aforementioned Hadjar. Now for Hadjar, really good recovery drive, really good start. Qualified 14th, out-qualified by his teammate Lawson by about 2.2 but good start. And again, alternative strategy, unlike which really worked for him. Really, really strong pace at the end of the race. And again, challenging the two Williams, but unfortunately not quite able to get ahead. I think for Racing Bulls, I think, with the I think they're kind of a big loser with this mid-season driver switch between Tsunoda and Lawson. First 2 races, with, the very, very experienced at this point relative to the other two. Tsunoda, kind of leading the charge in terms of, feedback, setup, that kind of thing. They were able to qualify very, very well, and they had very, very strong pace in both Grand Prix. Unfortunately, incredibly bad strategy the first race, a bit of bad luck with the front wing braking for Tsunoda the second race, and it feels like the races after they just kind of slipped a little bit back compared to Williams and even compared to Alpine, I would say. So I really feel like this is, a very, very strong car, about similar to pace to the Williams. And I think, Hadjar, good race pace, but I think qualifying left a little bit to be desired, and that's kind of holding him back a little bit in my power rankings. Now, number 5, I'm going to go with George Russell. Pretty solid Grand Prix for the British driver, for the Mercedes man. Qualifies 3rd, very, very close to being in the fight for pole. Out-qualifies his teammate Antonelli by 4.5 tenths. But again, for whatever reason, just didn't have the pace in the race. Whether that was, an inherent issue with the Mercedes, not able to deal with the high temperatures. But that being said, temperatures in Bahrain were also quite high, or whether it was just, Russell just not able to get in tune with the car, not able to, deliver those laps. Nonetheless, I think it was a good race from Russell, but again, not, a perfect race. And I think for me, there was really a pretty clear separation between the top 4 in my power rankings and then, the rest of the field. Now, number 4, I'm going to go with Max Verstappen. So Verstappen, going into the race, I think after qualifying, I think depending on how things went, I think, Verstappen was kind of number 1 on my power rankings. Absolutely superb pole lap. Kind of took it out of the bag in a place where, at a track where, going after Friday, I think they would have been very, very happy to be, P2 on the road. And again, I think if you told Verstappen, hey, you're going to be P2 on the Grand Prix after Friday, I think he would have been very, very happy. So I think on one hand, I think he'll be happy to, get those 18 points. But on another, he's definitely going to be, a bit upset with himself and, perhaps a bit upset with the stewards that, he kind of let that win get away. And I think it was really just, he lost a bit of a bad start, a bit too much. You can see on the onboard, he gets bogged down a little bit too much with the initial getaway, and that basically allows Piastri to kind of come alongside him and get slightly ahead / be alongside. Again, that's, a bit of point of controversy given it's not exactly clear, where exactly the apex is. And if, you look at some frames, Piastri is the one who's ahead. And if you look at other frames, Verstappen's the one who's ahead. So, all in all, I think Verstappen really, his one real big mistake today was the fact that he just had a bad start. And that really kind of caused, that ripple effect that, led to him having to kind of go off track at turn 1 to maintain the position, gave him the 5-second penalty, and basically left him on the back foot for the rest of the Grand Prix. His pace was very, very strong, arguably stronger than Suzuka, and this was a very winnable Grand Prix, I think, by Verstappen. One very, very small mistake, bit of a bad start, kind of undoing all of his work from Saturday. But still, I think, all in all, a pretty strong Grand Prix by the Red Bull driver. Now, number 3 is Carlos Sainz. I think finally getting some good points on the board. An overall, a very clean weekend, best of the rest in both qualifying and the race. Qualified P6, out-qualified both Tsunoda and out-qualified Hamilton, his replacement in Ferrari. Again, gap between himself and his teammate, pretty small, about 0.08 of a second. But then in the race, finishes P8. You kind of knew he was going to lose positions just because the Ferrari... better pace, again, Norris recovering through the field, better pace there. So again, really good result for Sainz, finishing best of the rest. Now, number 2 is your race winner, Oscar Piastri. And the reason why, Piastri is not number 1 is I felt like Piastri, I think, benefited from his 2 main rivals for this race, Verstappen and Norris making, big errors. Norris obviously in qualifying and then Verstappen at the start. And it kind of felt like on raw pace, Piastri was actually the slowest of the 3. But nonetheless, Piastri kept it very, very clean. Qualified P2, really good start. Got himself alongside Verstappen. And then the rest of the Grand Prix had really strong pace and did exactly what he needed to do to bring the win home. Very, very, very smart clinical drive by the Australian driver. But that being said, I think there was one driver who I felt like was performing even better than him, and that was your 3rd place driver, Charles Leclerc. For Leclerc, qualified 4th, which I felt was really the best he could have done, made Hamilton look unfortunately quite silly. Unfortunately for Hamilton, out-qualified him by half a second, and then in the race, very, very strong pace. Honestly, I think only 8 seconds behind Piastri at the end in a car that I think was quite a bit slower, much faster than the Mercedes, who I think were probably comparable with his car, and comes home for his first podium of the 2025 F1 season. So there you go. There's my power rankings for the 2025 Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. We have a 2-week break now. So I have a couple videos planned for this 2-week break. Looking forward to doing those. And I'll be back with my one video, which I think is going to be looking at who scored basically more points than they've been expected to. So basically, we're just going to be taking a look at the results for my expected points model. Other video, not exactly sure yet. I haven't decided, but again, looking forward to doing both of those. So anyway, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.